Our sign is the lantern of guidance and the ship to salvation, and the ship to salvation. الحسين مصباح الهدى وسفينة النجاة.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahu nuru wa samawati wal arz. In Surah Nur, verse 35, the Quran says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and earth. This verse inspires Lantern of Light's ethos of letting the divine light illuminate a God-centric approach to navigating faith, Allah's love, and finding your true self. Lantern of Light is a UK-registered charity that focuses on spiritual and mental well-being by bringing to viewers like yourself discourses and resources from the Islamic tradition to foster and encourage spiritual, mental, and emotional well-being. The platform provides a wide array of services ranging from workshops, retreats, a mental health helpline, podcasts, articles, and discussions in collaboration with leading Islamic scholars, academics, and health professionals worldwide. Lantern of Light caters to a large, close-knit, and thriving community of Muslim and non-Muslim brothers and sisters in faith from all over the globe. The platform is only able to carry out its activities and outreach through the generous donations of our audience. So please consider donating to the cause. If you like this discussion, please like, subscribe, and share with others. You can also check out the other programs from Muharram 2024 on our YouTube channel, website, Instagram, and Facebook pages. Our links are in the description below. While this session is pre-recorded, its broadcasting will coincide with the 8th of Muharram, a day most Shia Muslims associate with the commander of Hussein ibn Ali's army, Al-Fadl Abbas ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. The tragedy of Karbala is one of the most gut-wrenching events in human history, evidenced by the fact that almost 1400 years later, we are still mourning. It is difficult to describe the heroes of this battle, let alone Ghazi Abbas Salamdar. So I will borrow from Imam Zainul Abidin on his uncle. He says, "May Allah have mercy on Abbas, who preferred and favored his brother and ransomed him with himself, even to having his hands cut off and being compensated for them by God, powerful and lofty, as he did for Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, with 2 wings with which he flies with the angels in paradise. Al-Abbas has a station with Allah, blessed and sublime, for which all the martyrs would envy him on the day of resurrection." I have taken this quote from the biography of Hazrat Abbas titled The Outrider, and today we have with us the book's author, Dr. Christopher Paul Clohessy, to discuss the life and legacy of Hazrat Abbas. Dr. Clohessy is a South African Catholic priest who holds a BSc from the Pontifical Urbania University in Rome and a PhD from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, also in Rome. He is at present a faculty member of that institute, lecturing there in Shia Islamic Studies, Quranic Studies, Islamic Ethics, and Christian-Muslim Dialogue. He is also a visiting lecturer at the Pontifical Beta College in Rome, where he lectures in fundamental theology, ecclesiology, Islam, and Mariology. He is also the author of 4 books: Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad; Half of My Heart, the narratives of Zainab bint Ali; Angels Hastening, the Karbala's Dream, and his latest, The Outrider, all published by Gorgias Press. In 2021, he was also one of the recipients of the Iranian World Book Award as a distinguished researcher. His latest book, The Outrider, published in 2024, is the first of its kind academic biography of Al-Fadl Abbas in today's world. Al-Fadl Abbas was the first of 4 sons of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib with his wife Fatima bint Hussein, commonly known as Umul Banin. The book is part of a wider series by Gorgias Publications on Islamic history and studies, with an editorial and advisory board featuring some of the leading scholars on the Islamic world and academia. This particular book is unique in the sense that it not only aims to present a biographical account from primary historical sources, but is also written by our brother in faith from the Christian tradition, Dr. Clohessy. Assalamu alaikum, Doctor and Father. Welcome to the Lantern of Light podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you. This is the first time I'm talking publicly about this book. It's only just been published within the last few weeks, and I haven't had a chance to talk to anyone about it. So you're the first, and I'm delighted because I write my books in the hope of bringing a little bit of light into so much darkness that surrounds us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today and having had the chance of the honor of reading your book within the first few weeks of its publication. I'm very interested in not just talking to you about Hazrat Abbas, but also your academic interests and research. So I think that before we get into the main chapters of the book, let's first start our conversation regarding your academic journey as a researcher and writer in this book and the rest of your body of work as well. So my first question to you is that all of your published books, as I can tell, are on the Al-Abbas. What motivated you to write them, and then this particular book?
Well, I'd already decided as a professor, as an academic, and I'm not really an academic, I'm a perpetual student, constantly trying to learn. So as a student, I decided that I would specialize in Shi'i Islam, because at the time that I was beginning my time as a professor and as a student, Shi'i Islam was neglected in Western studies. Almost all of the Western scholarship concentrated on Sunni Islam. And I thought that a pity. And so I began my career, for want of a better word, by studying the life and concentrating on the life of Lady Fatima, who I thought was almost unknown in the Western world, unknown in Western studies. There'd been some texts about her that I didn't think very good. And so I began with Lady Fatima. And I have to say that all things considered, she remains my first love. I always end up returning to Lady Fatima, and I intend to write more about her. But my intent was to introduce Lady Fatima to a Western, not specifically Shi'i or Muslim audience, but simply to introduce her as a role model, as wife and mother and heroine. I then tried to do the same with Lady Zainab, because once again, you have in Lady Zainab this extraordinary personality who is greatly neglected in Western scholarship and Western studies. And I thought she deserves her own biography. And so too with this book. It was suggested a few years ago in London to me by a Shia friend that I should write on al-Fadl Al-Abbas. And I was really nervous about doing that because he's hugely loved and hugely popular, great devotion to him. He's a truly iconic figure, but there's very little written about him in the academic text. So I had to do a fair amount of searching. So generally, it was a desire to build bridges, and I thought that the Shi'i world, the Ahl Bayt, the theology and the spirituality of Shi'i Islam has been neglected in the West. Now there are many more people writing, but I thought to begin to bridge that gap.
Absolutely. I think, leading from this question, you say in the first chapter that somebody asked, I think you mentioned right now that, a friend suggested that you write this book. And in the first chapter, you say that you present this modest text with a certain disinclination and reluctance. And you identified two primary reasons for this. Firstly, the scarcity of academic resources and a dearth of primary sources. And secondly, due to your awareness of the historical and cultural distance and the difference in the worldview. Could you explain this further for your readers and our viewers?
Well, firstly, for example, there are almost no hadith about Al-Abbas. The one we quoted, you quoted at the beginning, coming down to us through Sheikh Saduq, but from Zain al-Abidin. This is one of the rare, almost the only hadith. Almost nothing exists in terms of hadith texts. And so already I was at a disadvantage because I had to rely only on the historical texts and on no other texts that commentated upon those. So we can return in a moment to the historical texts because they're important. But also, of course, there is a great difference of worldview in terms of things like heroism, martyrdom, the virtues to which we think God has called us between East and West. There's different ways of interpreting revelation, different ways of understanding what heroism is. And so I was trying to present really, I suppose, in essence, a 7th century hero of the Arabic Islamic world to a 21st century Western audience, often quite secular, attempting to show that these virtues that Al-Abbas shows are not religious virtues, they're human virtues that every human being, believe or not, is meant to live by. So, but there's a gap. There's a big gap to be crossed between Christian and Muslim, and then also between the Eastern, or let's say Middle Eastern worldview and the Western worldview as it stands at this moment.
Yeah. Just as a follow-up to this, I think you kind of mentioned this right now, and also in your book, that you're very well aware of the fact that you're writing this as a non-Muslim, and in your audience are obviously very devout Shias as well. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail as we get into the text of your work. But how have you sort of, how is this awareness of being a non-Muslim writing on a matter that is so, I would say, sensitive and close to Shia Muslims? How does that factor into your academic journey as well?
Well, after all these years, of course, I have many Shia friends, and Shia communities know me, and they know that I have profound respect for the Ahl Bayt, profound respect for the tenets of Shia Islam. I'm a devout and devoted and convinced Christian, but I do not fail to see these elements of holiness and greatness, and so I have a profound respect. I never ever write in an attempt to disparage or. I was nervous about Al-Abbas because he is very popular, and I was terrified of getting something wrong. So I really took a lot of advice over the last 3-4 years as I wrote the book, making sure that I was absolutely accurate in the way I was interpreting his actions. But as you write, as I wrote about Lady Zainab, as I wrote about Lady Fatima, as I wrote about Abul-Fadl, they become my companions for the years. And we become friends, really, and I grow more comfortable in their company. And because I respect them, I'm not going to say anything that is disparaging or anything that degrades them. I try to write academic history, but everybody who writes history has a particular interpretation that they bring to the fact, and I do that as well. It's my own interpretation, and I tread very, very carefully and cautiously. I mean, Lady Fatima is greatly loved, and again, with Lady Fatima, I was very careful about the way I presented her, because I don't want to in any way make people think that I am damaging her reputation, and the same with Abul-Fadl. So I hope, I haven't had much feedback yet because the book's only just out, but I hope I've succeeded in presenting him for who he really is. And he was a truly great man. Genuinely great human being. Put aside religious faith and all that. Just as a human being living out great human virtues, he was an exceptional person. And I grew to discover that over the 4 years that he was my very close companion.
Yeah. I've read your book. So as a Shia and as a, junior academic on her way, I could, vouch for the fact that you have really, been able to sort of satisfy the necessities of academic historiography and historicization, and then you're bringing us history writing as well. But then the Shia in me never felt offended, or never felt even that you left a lot out. And I think we'll come back to that as well. And for everybody who's watching, this book is definitely a must to read because of how much of detail and how much of effort that has obviously gone into it. You talk about 4 years of research. And so could you also elaborate on your research objectives? Like you mentioned, as a Christian theologian and historian, you see this very interesting line in the first chapter. It's that, you're determined that Al-Abbas be permitted to speak for himself through the earliest sources rather than manipulating the text, and so producing a portrait of Al-Abbas who is accessible to a Western or a non-Muslim readership, but who is less recognizable to Muslims themselves.
Yes, it's a lesson I've learned over the years that I don't want to write a user-friendly version of anything. I don't want to write a book in such a way that Western readers can say, oh, this is the sort of Muslim we like. I want Abbas to speak as much as possible through his own actions, and people are invited to interpret those actions for themselves. So I've tried as much as is possible to allow Abbas to be the one who speaks through the book rather than me interpreting his actions, because I want people to take Abbas for, on his own terms, not on my terms, to understand that he did extraordinarily brave things, heroic things, and there may be some people who think foolhardy things. There may be some who say, oh, well, why would you give your life just to get some water? So I want people to read the book and let Abbas speak into their lives his own actions without my interpretation. I don't want to be a blockage for people, but it is a very difficult thing, and because people are sensitive, and especially when you're devoted to somebody, people get nervous when especially a non-Muslim enters the field and begins to write about people who are profoundly, and people who have lived with the Karbala commemorations for their whole lives. They know far more about Abbas and what drove him than I do as a dry historian. I understand that, but again, I was writing specifically for a non-Muslim audience, or an audience that doesn't know this stuff very well. So I have to tread quite carefully. Did that answer you?
Yeah, it absolutely did. And I think
if I could just add a point, yes, certainly, as with the book on Lady Fatima, this is just a first book, and I think that Al-Abbas's life could never be put into one single volume forever, nor could the life of Lady Fatima. So I hope in the future to return to all my three subjects, which are Lady Fatima, Lady Zainab, and Al-Abbas, and perhaps produce other volumes that include other information. So it's always a first step forward.
Yeah, I think that's very exciting to hear as a scholar as well, and as a student to hear that this is, even as you have written and finished this book that is quite comprehensive, there's still things that you feel like, all right, I could go back, I could write another volume as well. And you also refer to Hazrat Abbas as lesser known outside of Shia scholarship and piety, and even within Shia devotion you consider him an academically and spiritually elusive character. Could you elaborate on this? What do you mean by academically and spiritually elusive?
Because Al-Abbas hides. He hides behind al-Husayn. He does not draw any attention to himself. He's wordless. You barely ever hear him say anything. We have moments when he speaks, but he only speaks when necessary. Otherwise, he's silent and heroic and obedient. And the impression that I got of Al-Abbas from the beginning. Now, so let's divide this into two. On the one hand, for a reason which we can begin to explore a little, the academic texts about Al-Abbas, for example, the historical texts, well, mostly they deal with those days around Karbala. There are very few historical texts dealing with his early life, for example. We have snippets and fragments of information. I'm talking here specifically of historical texts, not of other sources of information. On the days leading to and the day of Karbala when he died, then we have quite a number of historical texts recounting those historical moments on the battlefield. But all in all, the texts are very few. So already he's somewhat elusive historically. We have to dig deep to find information. But my impression of Al-Abbas as a personality is that he, despite being the moon of the Banu Hashim, despite being this bright light, he doesn't draw attention to himself. He directs the attention onto al-Husayn and hides behind Hussein a little bit. For me, as a Christian theologian, that's a very interesting field of stepping back and allowing the more important person to be seen. So that's what I meant by elusive. You have to dig hard to find and to hear Al-Abbas.
Yeah. So talking about historical and archival digging, you discuss the plethora of secondary resources and types of historical narrative and present, such as hagiographies and Shia liturgical literature, which for our audience would be literature, marsiya, so salam, eulogies. And could you also explain to our audience what the difference between these and academic sources are when you talk about hadith, when you talk about historical narrative, what are you referring to? And what do you think is the importance of knowing the difference for those who are interested in the history of the Ahlul Bayt, especially for the Shias that are so devoted to them?
So my own training is as an historian. That's my fundamental training. I mean, a theologian, but also a historian. So I'm always interested, firstly, in the primary historical texts, the primary sources. So in this case, the primary Arabic sources about Al-Abbas. So those would be the history books and the biographies, part of the history, and the hadith, of course. Now, Al-Abbas, there's almost no hadith about Al-Abbas, one or two. So therefore, I have to turn to the historical sources, the Arab historians. Later on, there are others, Western and Middle Eastern, who've written historical commentaries, but those are secondary sources. The primary Arabic sources for me are the Maqatil accounts, that is, the accounts of Karbala and of the death of al-Husayn, because that's where I find most information about Al-Abbas. Now, as you well know, there are very few Shia historians. Almost all the early Arabic Muslim historians, or not necessarily Arabic, but Persian as well, were Sunni. But the first text that I used is the text of Abu Mikhnaf, who was, I think, a Shia. Now, I had great fights in Iran about this with some of the Iranian scholars who insisted he's not. I am convinced that Abu Mikhnaf was what we might call a proto-Shia. That is, he was a member of that group that supported Ali. And one could prove this, I think. So his Maqtal is, for me, the most important. But of course, we don't possess it anymore. It's all disappeared. And all we have now are those Sunni authors who have used bits of him in theirs, such as Tabari and Baladri and a few others. So we have fragments of Abu Mikhnaf's Maqtal in the most important Sunni historians. So all of them talk about Al-Abbas and he's going to fetch water and his heroism and his death. So I used basically two major sources. I used Sheikh al-Mufid, because Sheikh al-Mufid literally gives us 9 points about Al-Abbas. And that was a very nice structure to work with. And I filled in Sheikh Mufid's 9 points with the important elements I drew from Abu Mikhnaf, especially as he's recorded by people like Tabari and Baladri and a little bit Ibn Sa'd. But it's very difficult. You really have to dig, and I enjoy doing that as an historian. So that's what I mean by the primary sources. It's the primary Arabic texts of history and hadith from those very early centuries of Islam. And then I tried to trace the development of the Abbas story down through the various Shia transmitters, right as far as Bihar al-Anwar. As soon as you get to Majlisi, you can kind of stop and say, okay, this is where I'm stopping. So that's kind of what I meant, yeah.
Yeah, just for our audience, when you mention you mean the of the Shia Imams?
Sorry, I lost you. You'll have to repeat that. I lost the signal.
Yeah. So I was just saying that it was a question that when you say ahadith, you mean the Shia Imams. The
Yes,
the
yes.
Shia Imams.
The four Shia books, major Shia books of hadith. Yeah.
Okay.
But
so,
of course, there's only one or two. There's only one or two hadith about Al-Abbas, including the one you quoted at the beginning. And whereas, when you're dealing with al-Husayn or with Lady Fatima, there are plenty of hadith, but Al-Abbas has very few.
Absolutely. So now that we've kind of understood the academic and historical context of the Outrider as outlined so well by Dr. Clohessy, and as I understood it, you're talking about your point of view as a devout Christian who's very interested in Shia studies as well, and that link between Catholicism and Shiaism is also present, and also interfaith dialogue. But I think one thing that really spoke out to me was when you're saying that his virtues and his personality, whether you think of it as larger than life historical, mythicization, or you think of it as a highly devout Muslim, like you said, there are lessons to learn from him for anybody who just wants to learn about valor and chivalry, and we're kind of get into that. And I just also wanted to note about the amount of engagement with historical sources, like we've talked about too, but you mentioned everyone from al-Dusi to al-Khazraj to Tabari, and it goes on. And I would and it's not just in regards to Hazrat Abbas, but you spend a lot of time going over primary and secondary resources concerning Hazrat Abbas's lineage, his mother, her tribe, and their tribal history. So much so that you go over like all the evidence for the tiniest interactions that could or couldn't have been between Hazrat Banin and Marwan ibn Hakam. So while we won't be able to cover all these aspects and a lot more, I would really encourage our viewers and all of you to fully understand the engagement that takes place in the Outrider, and also it takes place in sort of constructing modern day academic biographies of the Ahlul Bayt as well. And the Outrider is, for our viewers, it's easily available for purchase on Amazon and the press site, if I'm and so now let's move on to our Baabul Al-Fadl Abbas, with whom we associate the 8th of Muharram. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. Why was he named Abbas? And what are some of the nuanced Arabic links associated with the name Abbas?
So thank you. Yes, it's an interesting name, and it has a variety of derivatives that come from the name. Basically, his name could either refer to somebody who frowns, who is serious and stern and severe. But his name could also find its meaning in the Arabic word for lion. And specifically in his case, it seems to be a lion who does not fear its prey, or a lion who is feared by its prey because it is particularly strong. So I went into quite a lot of detail, I think in the introductory chapter 1, about the fact that this was the name that was given to him. And it was given to him, I think in the book, by his father, of course, Imam Ali, with all the knowledge that Imam Ali had as Imam of the future of this son of his, this son of al-Banin. And so he named him for the sternness that he would show one day and the ferocity that he would show one day in battle, the fierceness of a lion. So it's a lot more than that, because there are a number of words that derive from it. But that seems to be it. It's the sternness of the ferocious lion in battle that gives Al-Abbas his name.
There's also a surah in the Quran, Al-Abbas, the frowners as well. I think it's Surah 42 as well. So it is have those theological links as well. I think you talk about another link with the name of Abbas, Zirham as well, that shows up in the Arabic nuances.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember all of the details of his name, but specifically, it's the theme of lion, including there are other names for lion in Arabic. There are a number of names for lion, obviously. So it's mostly to do with this fierceness or this ferocity that he shows in moments of battle. Yeah, I can't remember all the details of the name, and he's given lots of other names. Of course, he's given a huge number of al-Qab, so these epithets, if you like, these al-Qab and kunya as well, including the moon of the Banu Hashim.
Yeah, Kamr Bani Hashim. So you mentioned in chapter 2 a long list of al-Qab or honorific titles. Could you go over some of the more well-known ones or the lesser-known ones and help us understand why he was known by them to his devotees in the present Shia community? And also at that time, perhaps it could help shed more light on his elusive character, these names.
I think there are 3 that stand out, and these are all among his alqab, his epithets. And I think the first is as-Saqa, the water carrier or the water bearer, because this relates directly to the thing that he is most celebrated for and the thing that he is most remembered for, this moment of extreme heroism of attempting to carry water to the women and children, mostly in the tents on the day of Karbala. So Al-Abbas as as-Saqa occurs in a number of the historical texts that he is given this epithet. He's also known, of course, as the moon of the Banu Hashim. This is a more difficult name, and it's difficult because of the context in which it is given. We can talk about this in a moment. He's given the name Abu al-Qirba, which means the father of the water skin. Again, it's this picture that is given of Al-Abbas riding back from the Euphrates with this water skin, or maybe more than one water skin strapped to him, maybe one in his mouth as well, riding with great difficulty. Of course, his name Abu al-Fadl is not only because he is the father of a boy named al-Fadl, but also because it means the father of virtue. So one could also apply it as a description of his name. And then there are a few others. He is always known as the Batal, the champion, whether it's the Batal of the Al-Qami tributary or the champion of Karbala. These are also names that are given to him. So almost all of his names focus in on the significant moments on the day of Karbala itself, and perhaps the 2 or 3 days preceding the day of battle. That's where the whole of Al-Abbas's history is shaped and formed.
Yeah. So it's interesting you talk about his history, but then you also mention how the stories of al-Husayn and al-Abbas live in a virtuous cycle, nurturing and fueling each other's story. Could you elaborate on this aspect?
So it's what I was saying earlier in the first place about how I think that Al-Abbas hides behind al-Husayn, so that the attention is always on al-Husayn, but he's always there. So on the day of Karbala, it is he who is given the most dangerous assignments by his brother, the most urgent assignments and the most dangerous assignments. For example, being the standard bearer. This is a very dangerous position of great honor, but it's a dangerous position. And also being sent to negotiate, being sent to fetch water, etc., etc. So he is the champion of al-Husayn. He's his negotiator and his champion and his brother and his defender. In Christian terms, I sometimes wonder, and I've wondered this about other figures in Islamic history, in Shia history. For example, what is the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and Imam Ali? And then the relationship between al-Husayn and Abul Fadl al-Abbas. and we would say in Christianity, the relationship between Yahya, John the Baptist, and Jesus, or the relationship between Simon Peter and Jesus. There's always this relationship of the one whom the other one depends upon, the right-hand man, the champion, and I think that you could argue for a pattern there in those relationships, and I think that you could quite justifiably put Al-Abbas into that relationship. I really do. Of being al-Husayn's, his backbone. In fact, al-Husayn, he says at the death, he says, my back is broken now, when he sees his brother lying mortally injured. It's a very moving moment, and you realize that Al-Abbas was everything to him. He relied on him, and he was his champion and almost his prime minister, really.
Yeah. And you also say that, Hazrat Abbas's support of Imam Hussein receives a lot more attention in the historical tradition than other family members of Imam Hussein. Why do you think that is? And could you also elaborate on how Hazrat Abbas then through history becomes a model for those who were loyal to Imam Hussein, and then the antithesis of Abbas would be he who betrays Imam Hussein as well?
So it's hard to answer the first question because we don't have the earlier history. We know from a number of Shia authors, but also Sunni historians, that when al-Husayn made ready to begin the journey to Kufa, really, Karbala, he had a number of people with him, family members, and Al-Abbas is always mentioned as one of those. So Al-Abbas is a loyal follower. He's also a brother. So al-Husayn has lost his other brother, al-Hassan, but he's still got Al-Abbas and Al-Abbas's 3 brothers by Banin. So al-Husayn has got at least 4 brothers, probably more, but at least 4 brothers with him. And since Al-Abbas is the eldest, he seems to play a specific role. So again, his history is somewhat hidden before the Karbala event. And by the Karbala event, I mean when al-Husayn first sets out for Karbala, not just the day of Karbala. And I think that over the centuries, the story, as it's been retold in lament, in the majalis setting or the ta'ziyah setting, the lament over Al-Abbas has built his character, because that's how characters build. The retelling is what history is. You can tell it in written form or you can tell it in oral form. And I think the retelling has made Al-Abbas this extraordinary figure of what we could call altruism, this complete lack of selfishness and complete focus on the rights of his brother Al-Husayn, and the justice for what he's fighting for, so that Al-Abbas forgets entirely about his own self. I think that grows naturally in history. When you come across somebody like that, you never forget them, and their story grows.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about, 2 of his major, I would say, I mean, if we dare say, characteristics from history, I mean, obviously lived memory, or like you said, history it's told in the retelling and in the Shia popular imagination. They're very specific, characteristics associated with Hazrat Abbas. So, but just to get deeper into his character, what happens, in your opinion, when we sort of combine a selflessness with the kind of silence that you talk about? You could say, as you mentioned, that he rarely spoke, but if needed, he was the first to speak. So how do we sort of, place this, like, as you said, in history, it's quite extraordinary to come across a man like Hazrat Abbas, who is silent and selfless, yet he is not passive, because he is very active on the battlefield.
Well, I've always believed, and this is a personal opinion, that silence is quite often a sign of strength. That you don't need to keep explaining yourself and defending yourself. And silence for me is often a form of great strength. And often truly great leaders don't have to say much. It's what they do that proves the point. And I think that's absolutely true of Al-Abbas. And again, everything I'm saying is my own particular interpretation of his life. I think that Al-Abbas doesn't have to prove himself in argument, although although, well, in fact, he doesn't. Some of his followers enter into discussion and debate around the waterhole while Al-Abbas is going off to do something else. That he proves himself in his actions. He proves himself a competent negotiator, because he wins time. He proves himself trustworthy even to the enemy because they trust in what he's saying and they agree to what he says. And he proves himself trustworthy in obeying his brother's commands. Quite clearly, even his own three brothers looked up to him because they were willing at his invitation to step forward and give their lives. He didn't force them; he invited them. So he seems to have a charismatic presence, which, exactly as you say, is silent but not passive. It's a very active presence, but without the need for explanations and words. And I think that's a wonderful gift, a wonderful grace in a human life.
Yeah, I think Maula Ali said that, the signs of being learned are forbearance, knowledge, and silence, and that silence is one of the doors of wisdom.
Yeah.
So then, talking about the other three brothers of Hazrat Abbas, and then we'll also quickly touch upon Hazrat Banin, because she plays a large part in not just your book, but also in Shia devotion as well. I think sometimes because the figure of Hazrat Abbas is so larger than life, and also history, I mean, whatever historical evidence is in support of that the younger three sons of Hazrat Banin kind of, take a slight backstage as well. But one of the incidences on the battlefields of Karbala that you spend time evaluating is the invitation from Shimr to the sons of Banin for amnesty or safe passage if they drop arms, if I'm not wrong. Would you elaborate a bit on this as well?
So if we were following Al-Mufid, Sheikh Al-Mufid, this is the second incident that he recounts. This offer of amnesty, but it's not one offer, it's two different offers. One comes from Shimr because he has a personal investment, that is that he comes from the same family as Banin, the same tribe as Banin. And the other comes from Ibn Ziyad himself, asked for by another family member of Banin. So you have two distant relatives of Banin trying to save these lives, trying to save the lives of these brothers. And I'm not convinced that the first relative didn't want to include al-Husayn amongst but anyway, so I'm not sure. In the book I discuss which came first. Was it, and I seem to think it was Shimr that came afterwards. So the promise of amnesty is brought from Ibn Ziyad, but it applies only to Al-Abbas and then his three brothers on the field, but not to Al-Husayn. And again, Al-Abbas is the first to speak, and he speaks for his three brothers, says, you can send back we don't need your amnesty. We have another amnesty from God himself. And then secondly, Shimr, in, I think, some desperation, because he's now dealing with relatives. These are his relatives. Whether we like it or not, he was a terrible man, but these are his relatives. So he's not acting selflessly. He's acting quite selfishly, trying to make sure that he's not going to be blamed for the death of his own relatives. He makes the second offer of amnesty to Al-Abbas and the three brothers. And again, Al-Abbas protests and says, you must be mad if you think we're going to walk off this battlefield and leave our brother Al-Husayn. And his three brothers don't need to agree with words, because it's quite clear they agree. So those three brothers, I felt an urge to deal with them a little bit because they are somewhat neglected. They also gave their lives for Al-Husayn. And in one or two Shi'i texts, very early texts, all four of the brothers go looking for water. Not just Al-Abbas, he and his three brothers go, and they're killed doing that, the three brothers. And Al-Abbas is the only one to return. So however we understand the story, those three brothers, all sons of the wonderful al-Banin, they also deserve a mention, deserve to have their stories told. And I've tried a little bit to not to let them go without naming them and discussing them a little, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you talk in great length about Hazrat Banin. In fact, there's a whole chapter for the viewers, dedicated to the mother and her sons. Could you also tell us about how her ancestry from a tribe known for their chivalry and valiance and poetry coalesces into the role of her lineage in Karbala and her poetic laments and eulogies after the events of Ashura? And as you mentioned earlier, I'm just putting two questions together that, sometimes 1400 years ago, even we as Muslims forget the kind of tribal links that were still present, because Karbala also happened 50 years after the demise of the Prophet. So it's the early Muslim society, as you said, that Shimmer was related to Banin, and how these, and how her tribe as well plays a big role, not just at Karbala, but later on as well. And you described this at quite some length.
So the roots of al-Banin stretch deep into the Jahiliyyah. That's the truth. That her roots are among all the great horsemen and all these chivalrous warriors, but of the time of Jahiliyyah. So Arabia, even in Jahiliyyah, was producing great poets, great horsemen, great soldiers. And my attention was struck, and I begin the book with this, that she had a distant relative who was famous because when he sat on his horse, his feet dragged on the ground because he was tall. And this is what is said also of Al-Abbas, that he was very tall and that his feet would drag the ground when he sat on his horse. And I thought, here's the link with hundreds of years between them, and I can't remember how many years exactly. You have this relative of al-Banin who is famous as a horseman and a tall, very tall horseman, and along comes her firstborn son by Ali, and he's also a very tall horseman of whom the very same thing is said. So I think personally she deserves her own biography, although I think, again, it would be quite difficult to write. She reminds me very much of Lady Fatima. It's hard not to see these two mothers and sons. In the case of Lady Fatima, she was already dead by the time that her son was martyred. But in the case of al-Banin, according to most, but not all authors, she was still alive at the time of Karbala, and that she would go and lament with the son, her grandson, the son of Al-Abbas, after the death of her son, although according to many texts, no, not many texts, according to some texts, she was eager to find out the fate of al-Husayn first, before her own son. Although that text is not widely dispersed, nonetheless, the text exists. Now, there is great dispute amongst Shi'i authors about whether Lady al-Banin was alive at the time of Karbala, and whether she actually did go to the cemetery, Baqi, to lament, and whether Marwan, this very curious figure who I wrote about because he's an interesting figure, whether he would come and listen and weep as she lamented. So there's a more modern Maqtal by Abdul Razak. He denies this completely. Now, he's a Shia writer. He says, no, she definitely was not alive by the time of Karbala. But many other authors who transmit this famous hadith about her going to lament, they say that she was alive. So it's difficult to know. But I always imagine Lady Fatima with her son and al-Banin with her eldest son, these two mothers, because you and I, where do we learn our virtue? We learn it at the knees of our parents. This is where we learn our most important lesson. We are shaped and formed by the model of our parents and by the way that they shape and form our lives. And so in Al-Abbas, as in al-Husayn, you have a young man who has been shaped and formed, of course, by his father, no doubt, but also by his mother, al-Banin. And so he reflects her. As Lady Fatima is reflected in the heroism of al-Husayn, so al-Banin's devotion and her resilience is reflected in the life of all four of her sons who go to their death defending al-Husayn. I think she's marvelous. And again, you have another woman who lived with such heroism and such sorrow, but never let go, never broke faith. And these are models for our time. It doesn't matter whether people are Christian or Muslim. We need models of ordinary people like us who didn't break faith, even in terrible times. And I think that al-Banin is a very good model of that. So perhaps one day a biography of al-Banin.
Inshallah, I would look forward to reading that. One thing that you mentioned when talking about Hazrat Banin was about how her name was also Fatima, but as you say, most of the sources say not to sort of, prolong or to be, mindful of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Hazrat Ali's mourning. She became known as Umul Banin. And I mean, obviously, this is just speculation. But like you mentioned, that virtue of selflessness that comes in Hazrat Abbas must come from her. So in a sense, she was also willing to sort of recede her name to Lady Fatima and then be known as Banin for all of history.
This is the tradition, and it is in one or two texts, that so as not to distress Imam Ali, who had lost his beloved Fatima, she did not go by her name Fatima, but she became eventually known as the mother of the sons, these 4 sons. And she's not the only al-Banin in history. There are a few al-Banins, and there were certainly al-Banins before her, who were also, because it's a title, it's a kunya, I think. Yeah, it's a kunya. So it's the mother of the sons. It was given to a number of important women in history, but she's the one who stands out, obviously. I mean, when you say al-Banin, she's the one you think of immediately.
Yeah. So coming back to now the main part of your book as well, and you can just, take your time in describing these for us. You talk about the 3 major roles played by Hazrat Abbas on the field of Karbala. We went over one of them briefly. Could you help us, understand those 3 major roles and why they are so important, and they speak to his character and also shape the narrative of Karbala and the memory of Karbala as we know it today?
So I followed the structure of Sheikh Mufid in his Kitabul Irshad, and he gives these 9 points, and within those 9 points I highlighted 3 which I thought were the most important moments on the battlefield for Al-Abbas. And the first thing is that he is invited to ride out to the enemy and negotiate, or to find out what they're doing and what they want. And so there'd been some offers made by the enemy, and there is in some texts the story of al-Husayn himself making a number of suggestions of what he could do. Now I'm not going to go into that because I'm not so sure of how accurate that is as history, whether al-Husayn actually did that. But nonetheless, there was an interest to know what the enemy was expecting, what they were wanting, because they were now drawing closer. And so on probably the night of the 9th, although timing is very difficult to work out, but possibly on the night of the 9th, al-Husayn sends his brother to the enemy to find out what the situation is. Are they advancing? Are they coming? Is there going to be battle? And then the enemy laid down the conditions that al-Husayn basically has to pay allegiance to the caliph, which he's not going to do. And Al-Abbas then says, let me ride back and tell him what you've said. Now, while he rides back, some of his men engage in a marvelous discussion around this kind of waterhole where they are. A marvelous discussion with some of the enemy about challenging them about, you realize that you're taking on the grandson of the Prophet, etc. Al-Abbas goes back to al-Husayn, and al-Husayn asks him to ride back to the enemy and ask for the night, that they could spend the night in prayer and reading Quran, reciting Quran. Because, says al-Husayn, you know how I love to recite Quran. So Al-Abbas then rides a second time to the enemy and says, this is what al-Husayn, but because Al-Abbas is a very good diplomat, he gives the impression to the enemy, and this is my interpretation, he gives the impression to the enemy that it's because al-Husayn wants to consider their offer. And I think he does that because he knows that this enemy couldn't care less about people reciting Quran. But if they thought that al-Husayn was going to consider their offer, they might be. And so Al-Abbas uses a very clever diplomacy and wins the night for Hussein, who is going to use it for prayer, but also for doing his will, his testament, and all the other important things. So that was the first important thing. Secondly, he is given the standard. All the history books, all the Sunni history books tell us that Al-Abbas was given the standard. But when you read about the enemy, the standard was given to some unknown soldier. It's never even remembered. But for al-Husayn, it was going to be Al-Abbas all along. So Al-Abbas is given the standard which is going to be carried in battle. Now, that probably happened after the third incident, and the third incident was going to fetch water. So I would suspect, and again, it's very difficult to find the timing, but I would suspect negotiation followed by Al-Abbas riding to get water, followed by Al-Abbas given the standard. Or if you follow the text that suggests that he went for water on the day of the battle, then it's the negotiation, the standard, and the water. And this is a big topic of debate. But he's given the standard, and this marks him out as a very important point. And then finally, he rides for water at the request of al-Husayn. The big issue is, when did he go for water? And how many times? So according to Abu Mikhnaf, who I think was a Shia, he didn't go for water on the day of Karbala. He went the day before and came back with water. He wasn't killed. He came back with water. This was taken up by the Sunni historians. So all the Sunni historians have Al-Abbas going for water somewhere around the 9th of Muharram, maybe the 8th, but probably the 9th. Then you pick up the later Shia texts and they change it to the day of Karbala. But I don't think myself they changed it. I think that almost certainly Al-Abbas went more than once for water. I can't believe that he only went once. The water was cut off for days. I cannot believe he only went once. So I think that he went successfully to fetch water on the day before the battle, and he brought water back to the camp. And I think he went to fetch water again towards the end of the battle, and he was killed doing it. That's my own interpretation. So he is the water bearer.
So I think going from this, then we could say that, in popular Shia memory, the idea is that, obviously water was cut off from the 3rd of Muharram, some say the 7th, but that there was no water, on the 9th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. But as you have said, and as a lot of historians record as well, and I think that this is what makes Hazrat Abbas the champion, that he was successful a few times, and with his brothers who were helping him, because at the end of the day, it is a sleuth, like what we would call like a guerrilla move in today's, where 2 to 3 to 4 soldiers go, they perform a small mission, and they come back. So you're saying that it happened a few times, and he was able to go and come back, and it's his last time, because one of the greatest, I think, at least in South Asia, from where I am, one of the most predominant factors about Hazrat Abbas is his loyalty and his word, right? So if he gives the word to the daughter of Imam Hussein, Ruqayya or Sukaina or Sakina, however we remember her, it's the fact that, when he is unable to bring water back the last time, he asks for his corpse not to be taken back, because he is so, in what do we say? He's ashamed to face the women, and he's ashamed to face the children, because he's not able to bring water this time. And somehow, talking about when you say that, it could have been that he brought water more than once, just to, widely speculate here. But, the hope that they have that he will bring water, it does suggest that a few times he has accomplished the impossible and brought that water in somehow.
I'm fascinated too by the fact that, and again, this is my theory, that he certainly fetched water the day before successfully, but that on the day of Karbala, probably quite late in the battle rather than earlier, because we are told he's the last one to die before al-Husayn. So if that's true, then he went to fetch water and was killed doing that towards the end, not towards the beginning. That even late in the battle, the cries of the woman are enough to distress him. This is the heroism of Al-Abbas, that he never for a moment forgets about those women and those children in the tents, that even at the height of battle, when things are looking at their worst, he's still got one ear on the tents of women. And for me, that's a marvelous, that's real heroism and real altruism. And then he goes knowing that he's completely outnumbered now. Now he doesn't have a group with him, he's alone. In some texts, he and al-Husayn go together, but he's generally alone now. And then the last to die. And that's the end for al-Husayn. He sees his whole world collapsing in a sense, that he's lost his right-hand man.
Yeah. So coming to the martyrdom of Hazrat Abbas, so there are two sides of the historical record. One says that Hazrat Abbas was the last to die before Imam Hussein. The others say that Ali Akbar Ibn Hussein and Ali Asghar Ibn Hussein were alive before were alive, and Hazrat Abbas passed away before them. Could you sort of walk us through these historical divergence?
It's really difficult. In fact, there's another option, because there was a member of al-Husayn's army who was wounded and revived after al-Husayn was killed, and then tried to fight and was killed. So in theory, he was the last to die. I name him in the book. So I follow the theory that Al-Abbas was the last before al-Husayn, because we know of the incident of the incident of the child, the baby being killed in al-Husayn's arms, and we know that his oldest son Ali al-Akbar was one of the first to be killed. He goes out quite early, and so I follow the theory that it was in fact Al-Abbas at the end, the standard bearer, who was still bearing the standard, who is the last, or almost the last to die. Because in my book of Lady Zainab, I've actually tried to produce a chronology of the day, of the moments that events happen. And we know that Ali al-Akbar was one of the first to go out. I mean, he went out early, and Lady Zainab came out to lament him. And we know that shortly before al-Husayn was killed, his youngest son was killed. So I think that puts Al-Abbas firmly in the position of being the last of the soldiers to be with al-Husayn, because many of the texts talk about the two of them going in together, trying to get to the Euphrates, and that's when the death happens. So you're dealing with very difficult eyewitness accounts, early histories, and to get an exact chronology is really, really difficult.
Absolutely. And I think while the precision of history is, of course, important, when we look at the millions of Shia devotees all over the world through 1400 years, the question that comes is that, of course, history matters, but does it matter? Would that change their idea of, or our idea of Hazrat Abbas during that time, you know? As
it
well,
shouldn't, it shouldn't change, because again, you know, the story is not just passed on by text, but also by word of mouth. And these stories give a certain, whether you're in Christianity or in Islam, the story of these early martyrs, these early heroes, they give a certain courage and inspiration and shape to our lives. Most history is exaggerated because it's always told from the perspective of the victor, not the one who loses. So most history has to be read very, very cautiously. And therefore, I think that the history that people pass down as part of their faith tradition is a parallel history. It has a spark of the divine in it. It's an important history. And I think it gives a very important shape to people's lives.
Absolutely. And just to, you know, we've covered a lot, but I just wanted to ask you if you could, because, you know, we've talked about larger than historical narrative, you know, with the dearth of ahadith and akhbar present, with very limited, you know, primary sources from basically 8th to 10th to 12th century that you looked through, you know, that you've looked through. How would you, for our viewers, put together, because what history does, it provides a record, but that record reflects a person, and that person for us has now become an archetype. So if you could sort of describe what the archetype of Hazrat Abbas is and how it appeals to, like you said, a universal audience.
So the first thing I think that's important to say is that you look at the actions of Al-Abbas, recorded historical actions on the day of Karbala. So you could take the three we've mentioned already, but there were two or three other important things like refusing amnesty. You take all of those actions and that gives a certain shape to the character of the man. You think, well, did he just suddenly become really great on that day? Or is this how he was as a human being? You know, if he'd done one big thing, we might have said, oh, well, it was, you know, a spur of the moment. But he's consistently heroic and selfless and brave on the day. And that makes me think that he was consistently heroic and brave before Karbala. And therefore, a series of consistent actions on one day give you a fair idea of what sort of person you're dealing with. Now, I've often said in the last few years that you know, each of the members of the Ahl Bayt for me have a particular virtue that stands out, or group of virtues that stand out. I think that for me, Al-Abbas is the antidote to the egoism of our world, that we're living in an egotistical world where everybody wants to be noticed and seen and heard and worshipped and honored, and where people generally are fixated with their own lives and needs. And then along comes Al-Abbas, who's completely the opposite of that. He's got no ego at all. He is selfless and altruistic, and in the middle of a battle can care about the cries of a child who's thirsty. So for me, in a world which has become enormously selfish and egotistical, where the I has become more important than anything, here you have this 7th century hero who was tough. He was a real man, he was a soldier, and he was completely without self, without ego, always hiding behind his brother. And I think of all his virtues, that for me is what makes his life worth writing about and hopefully reading about.
Thank you so much for this, not just this last point. I think exactly, you know, sometimes even as Shia believers, we tend to focus on the larger than life aspects of Hazrat Abbas. His fame is, you know, for us notorious, but I think we don't realize, and after reading your book, like a historian's book, you realize history made his legacy out to be that way. But his selflessness and his silence in comparison to the activity in him, and then how fame is in his legacy, but selflessness is in his life. I think that's a beautiful parallel to draw as well. And I think your book really helps us realize these, which, you know, sometimes if you grow up in the tradition, you take for granted, you don't see that. And for the first time, I was like, oh wow, this is the model for selflessness. And this is somebody who is trying actively to be silent, but to act. And it's like, it would be contradictory, but it's paradoxical. And that's what makes him so enigmatic.
I mean, if you look at the world, the current situation, lots of people talking, very few people taking the right actions. And I think that's where Al-Abbas puts us to shame, truly.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you would like to add? We have a few questions we can take from some of our listeners.
Not really. I've just, again, it's been a wonderful experience in these years reading about him. He's been a close companion. I've learned a great deal from him and been inspired by him, as I was by Lady Zainab and Lady Fatima. So the book has been a joy to write, and I hope that people gain joy and pleasure from reading it.
Absolutely. So the first question we have for you is, how can we personify the virtues of Al-Abbas?
Well, I think precisely that, egotistical versus no ego, that all, you know, first of all, I think that the most important human virtue is integrity, because if we live with integrity, all the other virtues fall into place. If you are a person of integrity, you're going to be truthful and just and honest and fair, otherwise you're not. So, and I think that Al-Abbas, like al-Husayn, has this gift of integrity, that he is in public who he is in private. He is absolutely loyal to his word and faithful to his promise. But I think that the thing that stands out is this virtue of selflessness or altruism. And it's one of the virtues greatly lacking in the world today. And we need models to show us that such a life is not only possible, but it's a life that is pleasing to God. And it's a life that makes our world better rather than worse. And so, if I was to personify all of his virtues, I would say that he's a man of integrity who lived selflessly. And that for me is
Yeah, absolutely. And the last question that we have is that we know Al-Abbas as Baabul Hawaaiij, which is the door of giving. So do we have something like this in the Christian traditions as well?
I'm not sure if it's really the door of giving as much as the door of necessities or the door of needs. And of course, in Christian Catholic theology, this is a title given to Mary. She is the doorway, the one you go to in need, the one you go to when you are desperate, the mother you go to when you're desperate. So it's a beautiful title that he is, that in a sense that when you are in need or have great necessity in your life, you could turn to Al-Abbas as an inspiration and even as an intercessor. But in Christian theology, Mary certainly, but also some of the saints, similar titles are given to them: gateway of needs, or doorways of necessity. So it's a hugely popular title, and it's a marvelous thing to be called. To be described in that way suggests the sort of faith that people put in you, and they put that faith in you because you've proven yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Clohessy, for joining us today. If you could just remind our viewers where they can purchase your book from. It's available online.
The book should be on Amazon by now. I haven't actually looked, to be honest, but it should be. Or it's available at Georgias Press, Gorgias, Georgias Press. On the 13th, I will be in Peterborough, for those who are in that area, with a big book launch. And there will be books available at a reduced price. The trouble is that books these days are very expensive, and I understand that. So if anyone's around Peterborough on the 13th, I'll be there. And I'm sure there'll be other book launches. But in the meantime, certainly on Amazon, and hopefully by now on Amazon you can find secondhand copies, which should be much cheaper. I only ever buy secondhand books because I can't afford new books. So Amazon's very good for that. You could find secondhand books, and hopefully you can on Amazon.
Absolutely. And we'll leave a link for both the websites where the book can be purchased as well. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Clohessy, for joining us. And thank you all for watching. And please subscribe. And if you have enjoyed this video or you feel like you have learned from it as well, consider sharing it with your friends or making a small donation so we can keep continuing this work forward. Thank you so much for your time. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.